As a cricket journalist, I would travel sometimes up to 200 days a year. I loved watching cricket games. I loved going to new countries. It was an absolute dream. But there was one thing I hated more than anything else about it, and it was this little pin. The thing that I need to change my SIM card in every new country. The absolute worst thing about this pin and SIM cards is when I was traveling to the West Indies, of having to arrive in every new island or country and having to work out if I could still find this pin and then line up and get my SIM card in every single airport. Well, now we have the answer thanks to Sally. They can make it so you never have to worry about this nonsense ever again. They use an eSIM app that once you install once, it is easy, simple, and cheap. Oh, and it works in more than 160 countries. And you can throw these pins away forever, because now you just need to download the Sally app before your trip. And if you do it with our code, Good Areas, you get an exclusive 15% discount on Sally eSIM data plans. So before your next holiday or work trip or any time you have to travel to another country, download the Sally app and use the code Good Areas, or one word, at checkout, and you can travel like a pro with Sally.
Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the latest episode of the Footmarks podcast. I'm Behram Qazi, who you can find at DefMango on Twitter, and with me, as always, is Jarrod Kimber, who you can find literally everywhere. And the title for this particular episode of the Footmarks podcast is One Day Smudger. You guessed it, it's on Steve Smith's ODI career. And just to give you guys a bit of a backstory, our team at Good Areas wasn't particularly sure what we were supposed to do between the Champions Trophy and the IPL. And then Cheyenne and I were like, let's write something up on Steve Smith's ODI career, right? Because it is a complicated one. You've got 2 ODI World Cup medals, and most people who get to achieve that are, greats in the format. But then Smudger has a batting average of 43 and a strike rate of 87 in an era where, number 3 batters have done better than that. So it is a very, very complicated career to break down, isn't it, Jarrod?
I get, especially when Wagon Wheel first started, the amount of times I would be contacted by people going, how do you rate Steve Smith's career? And I don't think I've ever had a great answer for it. And it was funny. Who wrote the draft of the original piece? Was it you and Cheyenne together?
Yeah, it was a combined effort between Cheyenne and myself.
Because I'm reading through it and I was like, yeah, this kind of fits what I think, which is he's top level. And there was that one year when he made all those runs where you're just like, he's absolutely and utterly a great player. But he wasn't like that most of the time. He was a pretty ordinary. And my other memory was there would be little patches where he'd make lots of runs in Australia and then he would disappear. And again, that sort of comes out in your research, doesn't it? So I think all things considered, he's kind of like Kane Williamson without the cheerleading, right? Because Kane Williamson and Ross Taylor were like the centerpieces of that side, right? I know Martin Guptill got a little bit for a little while, but basically Williamson and Taylor were. Whereas Maxwell exists, Warner exists. You even had Finch, right, at different times. Like you've had lots of other players probably taking the limelight away from Smith, even when he's been good. And then he hasn't always been good.
It is interesting, isn't it? And I mean, when I looked up the raw numbers, I was like, okay, 12 tons, 35 50s. He's played in 154 innings in ODI cricket. And I mean, 5,800 runs are still significant, right? But here's where it gets tricky. He's played 154 innings across, 15 years. And that kind of tells you about the decreasing popularity of ODI cricket, but also, sure, we can look at 5,800 runs as significant, but then again, Virat Kohli has more runs in singles alone. So ODIs are a dying format, and Smith probably didn't ever take them as seriously as he took Test cricket, I feel.
I certainly don't think he did. It's funny. I remember watching him when he was very young in the Big Bash, and at that stage, you kind of saw him as a potential star. He could bowl, he could field, and he would smash the ball and everything. And obviously you see late career Steve Smith in Test cricket or any career, any time when he was in Test cricket, and he was fantastic at that. I don't really remember outside of one year where I thought this is the guy who really enjoys ODI cricket or is really made for ODI cricket. The 5,800 runs is really interesting because that has him, I'm just looking at this now, it has him between Ronnie Sarwan and Carl Hooper. right? Like, do you know what I mean? Martin Medulla is like, what's Martin Medulla on? 5, 6, 8, 9, right? Wow. And you're gonna like this. Just ahead of Sawan, Ramiz Raja. Like, wow, this is not royalty, is it? And you're right. I think it also suggests he hasn't played as many games because of the format dying. But also, don't think he was always available for games in the same way that he they didn't always play their major players. So it isn't just there's less ODIs. I don't think he always played. It'd be interesting to see how many ODIs there were in that period compared to how many he played.
Especially post 2019, right? That's when he really stops playing ODI cricket for huge chunks for Australia because, all international teams, barring Pakistan perhaps, they started or didn't really give a fuck about bilaterals anymore.
See, I think Australia started that before. I think Australia is the first team to really rest and rotate their players for ODI cricket. I'm not sure if he was one of them. I'd have to go back and have a look at the numbers. But yeah, you look at this and you're like, well, he's made slightly more runs than Hamilton Mazzacatsa and Suresh Raina. Like, when you think about it from that point of view, it's not a lot. But having said that, David Warner only has 1,000 more runs, right? Like, there are other players around that area. So it's clearly partly the era that he played in, partly the sandpaper suspension. Although I'm not sure how many one days he missed out in there, but maybe it was a few. And then partly the fact that Australia hasn't always put their major team out. So, as you said, if Virat Kohli has 3 times as many runs and more? No, not 3 times. Sachin has 3 times as many runs. Virat Kohli has more runs just in singles.
Yep.
We're not really comparing him to the top of the tree, are we?
No, not by any stretch. But there is a caveat to his career as well, because Steve Smith goes on and makes his ODI debut back in Feb 2010. And he's only 20 years of age at that time, which is very unusual for Australian cricketers, right? You don't see Australia kind of throwing in a 20-year-old in international cricket all too frequently. And it isn't until September 2014 that Steve Smith gets good at ODI cricket. So up until September 2014, he's batted in 25 innings, he's averaging 21, he's got no 50s and no 100s. But then to think that he more than doubles his average from that point on till the end of his career, that is a big step up. And you could say that probably is mostly because of his promotion up the batting order, because he was like batting in the lower order or lower middle order for the first 3-4 years. And then also he kind of cracked Test cricket right at that point as well, 2013-14. So he had evolved as a batter too.
He plays 5 Test matches in 2010, 2011. And I was at least 2 of them, maybe 3 of them even. Because 2011 I think was the Ashes. So I was probably at like almost all of those Test matches, right? And he was not an international quality batter at that stage. Like he wasn't trusting his technique or anything at that point. And so he probably plays more ODI cricket because of the bowling and the fielding. And remember, they're batting him at number 7. So he probably plays more ODI cricket when he's crap than he does Test cricket when he's crap. And this is one of those things that when people look at someone's overall batting average and they're like, well, he only averages or he averages. And you're like, yeah, did they play when they were crap? When they were young? Yeah. When they were old? When they were over the hill? Because in his case, his Test numbers look better because he was so bad at Test cricket at times that they didn't think they could even put him in the side. So in one-day cricket, I think that's probably played a part. And 2014 is when he comes back. Well, 2013 is his breakthrough Test year. 2014, he plays 9 tests and he averages 81, right? Like he was legit by that stage. So them moving him up the order at that point probably makes sense. Even when you look at his numbers from then onwards, there's still question marks though, isn't there? It's not as if it's not just that. Although that does play a part because, I mean, thinking back on it, what the hell were they doing batting him at number 7?
I mean, look, my memory of all of this is that Australia brought Steve Smith into their first team because of his leg spin. They were like, oh, we get a wrist spinner who can kind of bat. And I remember commentators at the time saying, oh, is this the next Shane Warne, which was their favorite thing to say, remember? And I mean, that is kind of unfair to Steve Smith because I don't know how many people know this, but he was a frontline batter in junior level cricket. It's not like he started off as a wrist spinner.
I don't know I'd have to go back and have a look. I don't think that was the test thing. And you're talking about against Pakistan when he made his test debut. That was certainly the case. Him and Marcus North were both playing, despite being batters, for their bowling, which is remarkable now.
Yeah. I mean, we saw that with Manas a decade later.
Mana still had it. I mean, Cameron Smith had it. Australia did it with a lot of players. I remember telling Marcus North once he had the best figures in Sheffield Shield for a spinner that year, and he goes, well, that does explain it, but I still thought it was a bit odd. In 2011, he plays 20 matches, Smith, in ODI cricket. So that's a lot of ODI cricket. Yeah. My guess is it's more a combination of the fact he could field as well. So at number 7, you have, at that stage, I would say he was the best fielder in the world, or at least on that level of Faf and AB de Villiers at that point, right? He was, because even though he's a great fielder now, he's not as quick and as athletic as he was when he was young. He was just some of the things he would do. So I think they were like, we can get a great fielder in the side, and number 7 can bat, and we're going to get 5 or 6 overs, and then we can, because Clark would have been playing at that stage. I'd have to look at the full lineup, but there would have been someone above him also that could do a little bit of bowling.
Watto was around?
Watto would have been the other one. Yeah. So they would have been like, we can get enough bowling out of our top 7 without having to make him front line. But I think in one-day cricket, it was more the 3, what do they call it in baseball? 3-tool player, rather than, whereas in test matches, it was. Like, I mean, he made his debut batting at like 8. Didn't he?
Yeah.
In Test cricket. And he actually batted at 9 because I think Mitchell Johnson went ahead of him as a night watch in one innings. So you can, that's very different, I think, than what they did. But yeah, it's still, he wasn't picked as a specialist batter because if he was, you wouldn't bat him at 7, right?
Absolutely. But the number 3 thing is very, very important over here because Steve Smith averaged 52 as a number 3 batter. And while his strike rate was still 86, those numbers are at least Smith-esque, right? 11 of his 12 ODI tons were scored at first drop. And in all other batting positions in this format, he was averaging around 29. So keeping all of that stuff in mind, the fact that only 95 of Steve Smith's 154 innings in ODI cricket came at first drop, it kind of seems like a sort of injustice to me, to Smudger, by Australian cricket.
Yes. I suppose he would have played more. Like, how many of those are late going to number 4? Right? So when does he... Because when Manas comes in, he starts batting at number 4 in 2019 in that World Cup. I can't remember who batted at 3 in that World Cup. But he starts batting at number 4 then. And then I think the next time he goes to 4 is for the 23 World Cup when Manas came back into the side, or came into the side. So Usman Khawaja was batting at 3 ahead of him, which, okay, looking back on not the most ideal. I don't know how Australia didn't win that World Cup. And so it's basically 2 World Cups in a row he goes down to number 4. It's also possible that they didn't look at those sorts of numbers, and so they might not have noticed this. But the interesting thing about number 4, and I only know this because I know you guys wrote the piece a couple of days ago, but I was just going through all the numbers. When he was in peak form in 2014, he makes 73, 104, 67, 37, and 47 across a bunch of games in a row, batting at number 4, right? He then doesn't, he bats a little bit at number 4 after that and doesn't do much. And then he keeps coming in and out of number 4 position and not playing it all that much. As I said, he comes back for the 2019 World Cup. So before Sandpaper Gate, they started him at number 4. Then he gets suspended. Then he comes back for the World Cup and he's batting at number 4. Then he goes back to number 3 again. Then Manas comes back in the side. So there is an element of maybe he would have cracked number 4 if he just had a proper run at it, because there's nothing in his game that suggests he shouldn't. And I remember talking to people in the Australian camp and they were saying, where do you think he should bat? And I hadn't looked at those numbers. And my first thought was, well, he's a number 4 and that's where he would be very good. But I think he probably preferred to bat at number 3. When we looked at the advanced numbers, his career is very similar to someone like Kumar Sangakkara from a strike rate and a Zulu strike rate and average.
It's also similar to Damien Martin, isn't it?
Yeah, but the one difference I would say is that Kumar Sangakkara made 14,000 runs at number 3, or probably mostly at number 3. So there is an element of, even if, and Kumar is remembered as a better ODI player now because of the 2015 World Cup where he went ballistic at the end. Whereas for a long time, I think we also thought of him as a more solid ODI player. But looking back on it, I think you would have that conversation. It would be I know he wanted to bat number 3 for a long time because I'm positive they had that conversation with him about T20 cricket as well, where they were desperate to move him to number 4 in T20s. And he just didn't see himself in that role. So I think there's a bit of dumb luck in his number 4 number. So if you look at it, what do you say? 94 times batting at number 3 and 34 times batting at number 4. So even though he started at number 7, he still spent the vast majority of his career in the 2 positions that made the most sense. So this isn't like a Lance Klusner situation, is it? Right? Like where he was batting out of position his whole career. This is probably
a Joe Root type situation where England forced him up the order 1 position in Test cricket just to kind of work out the combination.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Joe Root's numbers at number 3 are not particularly spectacular either, by the way.
It is a weird one, isn't it? But anyway, you spoke of Steve Smith's speak in ODI cricket like 5 minutes ago, and I'm really confused as to deciphering what that peak entails. Because 2015 and 16, after he has a breakthrough in late 2014 in ODI cricket, Smith averages 50 plus in ODI cricket for 2 calendar years straight, right? He lifts a World Cup in the process, in which he's also played a pivotal role, let's not forget. And you could say that role clarity and general evolution as a batter would have played a role over here, right? Or part. But then we come to 2020 and he has his freak year. This is the only year where Smith strikes the ball at better than run a ball. So a striker of 106 and an average of 63. He smashes 2 back-to-back 62 ball tons versus an Indian team which featured both of Shami and Bumrah. And isn't it kind of weird that he never has that sort of year ever again? Right? Like, where does that Steve Smith go? What is this peak?
That's the one. For me, that's his peak because that year was probably the only year for me where I was like, oh my God. Like, if he just keeps doing this. Because this is what I don't understand about. And I almost throw Kane Williamson in there as well. But I just don't understand why they don't score slightly faster. I'm not saying they need to score at like 110 strike rate. But I don't understand why they're not in the 90s because they can score off any ball they want to. Right? They see the ball 5 minutes before any other batter.
Especially Steve Smith, who shuffles and, twitches and nudges the ball everywhere.
Yeah. How do you set a field in a one-day game to stop him? I don't really understand why he doesn't score quicker. And that was the year where he scores it over a run of ball, the only one for his career, and massively, he's miles ahead of every other year that he's had there. And I remember those knocks in Australia because it wasn't long before that. I want to say it was around 2018, so probably before the sandpaper ban. I remember like the Australian batting order was so slow. And they were really getting stuck. And he was a major culprit of this, of just not going anywhere, right? And so in 2020, I was like, oh, okay, he's worked it out now. And then he just never did it again, right? Yeah. And also, as you said before, he was doing it against some of the best bowling attacks. This wasn't like, he wasn't making runs against Scotland on the Pal. Like, he was doing it against Bumrah. Like, and then it just disappeared. It's a very weird situation, really, all things considered.
It's crazy, honestly, especially when you look at 2022, because Smith doesn't play any ODIs in 2021. Now, it could be due to COVID or perhaps just because Australia were rotating and not playing their first strength team. But he actually averages 67 in ODIs. Yeah. He averages 67 in ODIs in 2022, but his strike rate drops to 81. Now, my question is, and beyond that, of course, there's a natural regression and he's never the same batter again, right? Was it reflexes? Was it the end of a very short peak in the format? Was it form related? Did he just stop taking the format seriously? Was it COVID? Like, what was it? What happened?
I think there was a reaction to, and they would never probably admit this publicly, but I think there was a bit of a reaction to, oh, wait, England is playing really, really fast and we're not catching up. And so I think there was a movement in Australian cricket because, as I said, they were thinking about this in 2018. I think it was 2018. I remember watching Australia played England for a bunch of ODIs. And I remember watching these ODIs and just the commentators were just getting stuck in because the Australians just couldn't catch up. They just couldn't score at that pace. 2019 World Cup, I still think they thought they'd get away with it. Not get away with it from but I still think they thought we'll turn up at the World Cup and we'll be fine. And it didn't happen, right? So I think there was a conscious movement towards that. What I can't tell you is why he then moves back again. But I don't think, and I've been watching him since he was a kid, right? Like in T20 cricket, that's where I first saw him, was in the Big Bash.
Yeah.
I just don't think he's a natural fast scorer. Like, I don't think he feels comfortable scoring fast. And I think he will find any excuse he can to go back within himself and start knocking the ball around again. Like, that is what he wants to do.
But my question or counter argument over here is that we know that Steve Smith is more than capable of shifting gears. And I'm not just saying rotation of strike and that his strike rate in ODI should be at least 90. I'm talking proper power hitting, right? He might not be a natural hitter, but we've seen him, go berserk. And if you look at his ODI career, he's always followed that one rigid template where he'll knock it around in the power play in the middle overs and he'll only smash it when the death overs arrive. So, cricket has evolved crazy in this little period. And you see England in post 2015 ODI World Cup, and then now India is also doing it. So what kind of didn't encourage Smith to go in that direction?
I think we've seen this with Kohli at times, we've seen this with Williamson. They had a method that works. And so to them, why would you change that? And you get it at a certain point. Like, for all we're going to say about Smith here, when the wicket is at its worst, you'd probably still want Smith or Williamson at the crease. They're the sort of guys who can score runs when no one can. The issue is they don't give you enough in the other situations, right, to balance that in the way that they should. So I can't really explain it, Behram, because I wouldn't be suggesting it. Like, to me, it doesn't make a lot of sense.
But
they seem to be, but he seems to be focused in on the fact that he's going to knock it around. And I think with Smith, and this is a lot of great players are like this. Once they're good at something, you trying to tell them that the thing has changed around them is really, really tough, right? Like, I'm a Denver Nuggets fan. I've been watching Russell Westbrook. So I've been watching Russell Westbrook since he went to Houston. Well, I watched him before, but he was a great player. Then he went to Houston and he's been bouncing around all these teams. I think it's taken Russell Westbrook a couple of years to work out, I am no longer that Russell Westbrook, right? And a lot of players retire at that point.
I don't know what you have to say about this, but the best version of Russell Westbrook was the OKC version.
No, of course. But that was when he was young and in his peak, right? He comes out of that and he's still trying to play like OKC. But two things have happened. He's no longer in his peak and the sport has changed. When he was dominating the sport, three-pointers were a part of the sport, right? When he gets past his peak, three-pointers are the most important part, right? Yeah. So it took him 2 or 3 years to work out how to fit into the new NBA, and he was fighting it. You watch him with the Lakers and the Clippers, and you're like, what are you doing? Like, have you watched any basketball over the last couple of years? And now you watch him with Denver, and sometimes it's about the fit as well, but he understands his role. He's coming off the bench, and he's playing it well. It's really hard for a player of that level, and Smith is of that level, right? And talent-wise is absolutely of that level, to evolve and change during your career because you think, no, I'm doing the right thing. I've always done this. They've always paid me for this. So I do think there's an element of that.
Support us on Patreon and help us keep making our content. Join for exclusive perks like the AMAs, the live calls, and to chat with me directly on Discord. You can also enjoy ad-free content, early podcasts, and access to my emailer.
It's interesting how when we thought of writing this piece, Cheyenne and I, the general consensus amongst all three of us, throw Varun in this as well, is that Steve Smith is an underrated ODI batter. And this is what kind of drove us to write the piece in the first place. And then I come across certain things whilst doing my research where I'm like, dude, is he like overrated at times? Because if you look at the home and away record, it paints a very weird picture. Like, sure, in Australia, he's great. 60 innings down under, a batting average of nearly 57, and his strike rate is also 93 plus. 9 of his 12 ODI tons have been scored on home soil as well. But that average then drops into the mid-30s away from home, and the strike rate is also in the low 80s. And honestly, that just plain and simple suggests that in ODI cricket, Steve Smith was a home track bully. And it doesn't make sense to me because that's something that doesn't hold up in Test cricket. You know, he's been phenomenal in Asia, for instance, in Tests. So I just don't understand it, you know?
And England, like he's dominated England, right? Like I think it's a really interesting one of
I would say when I read that part, I just closed my eyes and I thought of Steve Smith, and I was like, I really would say that the vast majority of the times I've seen him at his best in ODI cricket, he's been in Australia.
Yeah.
Right. Like it really stuck me. And as you said, it doesn't really make sense because he's fine in Test cricket everywhere else.
Yep.
And you're talking about, was it 57 and 93 strike rate?
Yes.
Is that what it was? Right.
Which is
that's
awesome.
Great. No one's arguing that if he'd kept those numbers for an entire career, we would say it's great. And the other numbers are...
It's basically like he's David Warner in ODI cricket, right? What David Warner is in Test cricket, Steve Smith is in ODIs. Kind of.
Yeah. And then away from home, do you have the numbers in front of you? I mean, they're not good.
Yeah, I mean, they're terrible. Mid-30s is the average, and strike rate is in the low 80s. It's not good at all.
So that's a replacement level player, really. I mean, if you're playing for a poor team, like, a bad batting West Indies team, or maybe Bangladesh when they're struggling, you play, but you're not an automatic selection, are you? Right?
Yeah.
Like you're a low end player. And it's in both counts. That's the thing that I find interesting. He's not actually scoring quickly, and he's not staying in for very long. That doesn't make any sense to me. But the one thing I would say about him being underrated and overrated at the same time might mean that he's correctly rated. No, what I was about to say about that is, I think one of the reasons I've been asked this question so much is people like you who remember a few key innings that were absolutely incredible. But when you go back through his numbers, I do think that he's been very good in very important knockout games in World Cups. And he's been very good against India. Now, if you play bilateral games, the most important bilateral games you're going to play for legacy are going to be against India.
Yep.
And the most important World Cup games you're going to play are going to be knockout games.
True.
Right? The whole world is much more interested in those two things than they are in anything else in your career. So my question would be, and this is what I always felt, that he wasn't actually particularly inspired or excited by ODI cricket, but with a challenge, he would Steve Smith it. But most of the time, he was half-assing it. And that's how I felt. And I've talked to Trent Woodhill about this, who's his longtime batting coach before. I'm like, sometimes, because Trent would be like, oh, he's working on this new thing or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, but does he give a shit? Because he doesn't seem to give a shit, right? It's like, was it last year in the Big Bash when he suddenly decided to take the Big Bash seriously and just went absolutely on a tear? And we're like, well, what happened the rest of your career, buddy? Yeah. Like you never really showed that much interest in it. And then suddenly last year he decided that he was all in. And I feel that's kind of how I feel about ODI cricket. Maybe in 2020 he decided that he was all in, right? Maybe against India, maybe in World Cup knockout games. But for the vast majority of the time, I've been watching him thinking to myself, he's okay, like he's fine, and he can play some good innings, but I'm not sure how interested he is. And it's in there, like, to go back to what we were saying before, there's no reason why he couldn't have averaged 45 with a strike rate of 96 in ODI cricket. Like, you would never be able to convince me that he couldn't have averaged way higher with that kind of a strike rate based on having watched him play. I just think he could have done it, and he hasn't got really close to those numbers.
Yeah, it's true. And the notion that he does well when he starts to care, it kind of checks out when you look at his record versus India, right? Now, of course, Steve Smith versus India is a love story penned down in cricketing heaven, penned down by the angel Gulbuddin, if you will, right? And, his batting average in Test cricket versus India is 59. In ODIs, it's 54. 5 of his 12 tons in ODI cricket come versus India, and that includes that, worldie of a ton in the 2015 World Cup semi-final that we all remember, which is probably what made us write this piece in the first place. And it's crazy, though, that if you put India aside, his numbers versus other opposition teams who he's batted against at least 5 times, they don't quite stack up. Like, it's increasingly remarkable because let's take the West Indies out of it, right? Because he's averaging 61 versus them, but the strike rate is 79, right? He's not got 100. He's basically Shea Hoped it versus the West Indies. Apart from them, it's just Pakistan and New Zealand who he's done all right against, averaging in the low to mid 40s. Everyone else, it's under 30. And again, one of those weird things that you really can't make sense of.
No. I mean, that's the thing. If he wasn't dominating these sides in Test cricket, we could at least point to that.
Yep.
But it really, again, that's why I think there's a sense of motivation about this. He was never really close to being dropped by the Australian team. I know they had some conversations, but you're not going to drop Steve Smith, especially because they didn't have that many other test batters. Long form ODI batters to replace him with, right? So his position was always safe. And that's not an issue at all. Like we would both agree with that. But it did feel like he needed some extra motivation, right? Yeah. And India, for whatever reason, brought that out in him. And again, not to dwell too much on like his Big Bash form, but it's a bit the same. You go back and you have a look at the Big Bash, and you know some years he's just knocking it around, and then just every now and again he turns it on. He clearly can't turn it on all the time, because if he could have, he would have. Is my guess, right?
Plus, also, if he's looking at his career at this point where he's retired from ODIs, he clearly wants to play more Test cricket. And he might not mind a couple of T20 contracts, which is what makes him try harder in the Big Bash this year.
I mean, it could be. It could be that as well. It could also be that T20 cricket sort of naturally changes his mindset, if that makes sense. Like, I think, you know, with T20 cricket, if you think about it, he has to go a little bit harder early on. Whereas in ODI cricket, this was one of the other things with him. I remember looking his T20 numbers up years ago, and him and Kane Williamson were almost identical in that they both had ridiculously good records at the death. And I think Smith was even better than Williamson. But they don't always get to the death, and they don't always kick on when they get to the death, because that's not how they think about the game.
And sometimes they have a tendency to get stuck in the middle overs as well. Which is baffling, because they are fault batters shouldn't get stuck.
Exactly. And it's like they get caught in like a perpetual third gear. It's so easy for them to do that sort of strike rotation, I'm not going to go out, I'm not going to ball around type thing, that they don't just put the foot down. And look, it's really hard. Like, Virat Kohli is a much better ODI player than both of them, right? And we've seen him do it as well. And if you go back, you know... I saw Ricky Ponting do it. Like, you can go all the way back. There was a feeling in the old days that you waited as long as possible before you put the foot down. But even when these guys were shown a different way, they still didn't do it. And that's one of the more interesting things, I think, with Steve Smith.
Yeah, I think the fact that everyone around them in world cricket had kind of shifted gears and they still didn't is the major takeaway over here. But the India record is one thing, which is obviously spectacular for Steve Smith. But you also mentioned World Cup knockout record, right? This is insane. Like, if you think about it, he's got 450 plus scores in World Cup knockouts, which is a record that he shares with the great Sachin Tendulkar. And again, higher stakes probably bring the best out of him. And weirdly enough, his last ODI innings was also in an ICC knockout game, which was a questionable innings, but still scores a 50, right? So he has that in his legacy, at least.
Yeah, and again, that just shows his class. Like, it's not a big sample size, and there aren't that many players who've played knockout. Do you know what I mean? We can go through all the different things, but that's kind of what you would expect of someone like him or Kane Williamson, right? That they've been in those games and they put those innings in, and runs on the board in those games are important, and blah, 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 blah. But again, it does show that, like, if you're being mentioned in any statistic alongside Sachin Tendulkar, who played in 1 million tournaments, right? Literally all the World Cups. I think Sachin Tendulkar's been in every World Cup and all but one Champions Trophy. I could be wrong on that, Behram. We'll have to check it. And was a great player. They didn't always make the finals and everything else, India. But there is an element of like, okay, how has this happened? Because Australia's had a lot, like, Ponting's not on that list, right?
Yep.
Like, Ponting would have played a lot more one days, would have made a lot more runs, and would have played on, I would have thought, an equal amount of games. So again, it's one of those things where it's a really good stat and it points out exactly what we're talking about, but also it makes the other stats where he's not very good stand out more.
And it's not like he was good in World Cups overall. Of course, let's not forget 2015. And I feel like that's Steve Smith's finest hour in the format, right? Lifts the trophy, scores 402 runs in that, tournament at home, of course. Again, the whole home track bully thing. But his true average was 28 and his true strike rate was 12 in that tournament. He also had 5 consecutive 50s, which was, amazing. I mean, it is a phenomenal effort. No questions about it. But you look at 2019 and 2023, both ODI World Cups, he doesn't have positive numbers for both true average or true strike rate. So it's a knockout thing, not necessarily a World Cup thing.
Yeah, and again, it kind of is the inspiration there for the knockouts more than it is for the regular games. I wouldn't have thought so in 2019. Maybe even in 2023, they had to win a lot of games in a row, didn't they, to sort of come back into that tournament. So I can't answer what the issue is there. He played one good innings in 2023 in their semi-final, but to be honest, one of the reasons Australia got back in trouble in that semi-final was also because he got a bit stuck again, right? Yeah. He eventually helped dig them out of it, but he caused some of the issue that he then rectified himself. But yes, it's certainly a situation where you can find good signs of his career, but it's not like there are tons of them in a way that you would expect of a player of his talent.
When he went on a tear back in 2015 in that home World Cup, did you imagine that this was the best of Steve Smith that you might ever get to see in a World Cup? Because he was young. He had his whole career ahead of him. That could have been the beginning of something special, but he never quite replicated that same effort in a World Cup again.
I always thought he'd be a faster scorer than he was. And remember, the first version I saw of him was a completely different kind of player. But when I first saw him, like that second test match he plays is in Headingley. And he's smashing Danish Canaria into it wasn't even a rugby stand, I think. I think it was the construction site at that stage. I don't think there was any. I think they had to wait to get the balls, if I remember correctly.
Yep.
And I'd seen him in Big Bash. He was incredibly athletic. I'd seen him smack the ball around a little bit at times. And I was like, okay, this is another Ricky Ponting type level player, right? You know, young, can hit sixes, you know, incredibly elastic. And he's probably, and it didn't end up being that player, right? I mean, you said before, the nearest neighbor for him is Damian Martin. So fine player. No one's having a go at Damian Martin, but Damian Martin's much more well-known for his test career again than his one-day career. You know, and you look at the great number threes for Australia and you compare them, Dean Jones and Ricky Ponting are light years ahead of him, right? Not on average, but on Zulu numbers, not on average, but on strike rate.
I feel like the better question over here is that, of course, we all recognize that Punter and Dino are probably two of Australia's best, or definitely two of Australia's best number three batters. Who is the third best number three batter for Australian ODI cricket? Is it Watto? Is it Smudger? That's where it gets a bit tricky.
I can't. It would almost have to be him because Boone becomes an opener. So we talked about this before. Boone's got sneaky good record, right? And is slightly better than people remember him for, and was very good in World Cups and things like that.
And he could definitely chug down more beers than Steve Smith as well. There's that.
I'm not sure that's true, but but he ends up opening, so he really isn't a number three in ODI cricket at all. And then I'm just going through the list now. Mark Waugh was the number three, and he was very good, but he became a much better player when he opened.
Yep.
Greg Chappell, probably, I think if you look at Greg Chappell's numbers, he didn't even make 1,000 runs at number three, but they were pretty good. So Watto only did it 30 times, mate, right? Yeah. And he averaged 29. Michael Clark's got I was going to say he's got a good record. He averaged 40 batting there with a strike rate of 68. My God.
Okay, then. So maybe Steve Smith is the third best number three in ODI cricket for Australia.
Well, you look at this list. Ponting has 12,000 runs. Dean Jones has 5,100 runs and missed about 10 years of his career.
Yeah.
Next best on the list is Smith with 4,300. This is just number three, obviously. Yeah. And then Mark Waugh at 1,100. He's next best by default, right? But you think about those other two guys, they are far more thought of as one-day players and far more dynamic. And, you know, Dean Jones is a very important player in the history of one-day cricket. Ricky Ponting and winning World Cups and also, you know, the way that he played the game is very important. You're not putting Smith in that. And I think when you talk about Watto, I know he's not as a number three, but I think a lot of Watson's reputation probably does come through white ball cricket as much as anything.
Yes.
Whereas almost none of Smith's does outside of those handful of knocks that we've talked about.
Yeah, there's another very peculiar finding that we came across when we were writing this piece. We know how Steve Smith, and you guys should know this from our other footmarks that was like recorded 2 years ago or something, on how Steve Smith has a problem of not sleeping during test matches, and his average continues to drop per innings from 1 to 4. So he's best in the first innings of a test. He's second best in the second, and then third and fourth. It's a gradual decline. And he prefers batting versus the red ball when he doesn't have any target in sight and he's just setting the score. In ODIs, he prefers batting when he's chasing. And that is weird because even in T20s, he's a better batter when he bats first. It's another one of those weird things that neither of us could make sense of.
No. I didn't get that one at all. I'd never looked it up before. As I said, I've kind of not ignored his career, but it wasn't bad enough to interest me, and it wasn't good enough to interest me, right? So looking at those numbers,
you've basically just taken Steve Smith's ODI career as seriously as he has done himself.
Well, I always say that, like, in the job I have, it's very hard for me to pay attention to middle of the road. Do you know what I mean? If someone's great, I'm going to notice it. If someone's an outlier, I'm going to notice it. And if someone's terrible, I'm going to notice it. But in the middle, I'm like, there's a lot of people in the middle. I can't be doing that. So
the Mahmudullahs and the Ram Naresh Sawants and the Carl Hoopers and the Steve Smiths and the Ramiz Rajas.
You'll be shocked to know I've not done a lot of videos on Ramesh Sawant. So far, there's still time. So I think when you did that, I went and looked at it myself to have a look, and we had the feeling in Test cricket that he likes to bat when there's no ink has been spilled on the canvas, right? He likes to go out there when batting is the only thing that matters. That should be the first innings of ODI cricket, but I wonder if, and I was thinking about this later on, I wonder if there was an element of when you bat second in ODI cricket, it is just batting. It's batting to a number, right? When you bat first, you're batting to an invisible tempo, right? And he's not quite sure which level of the tempo he should go. Whereas in the second innings, he knows exactly what tempo he should go. But what's hilarious about everything I've just said is his strike rate is almost identical in both. So it's not like he actually changes his tempo, yeah?
That is really weird.
There is no change. It's not like Kohli where I think it's Kohli, I'm right in saying, where his strike rate goes up in the second innings. Or no, maybe it's not Kohli. There was someone I was looking at recently where it's quite clear that they change completely in the second innings. It's just, he's just not like that. And he's a fascinating dude, isn't he, really? Maybe it's asleep. I don't know.
It is really fascinating, right? Truly remarkable and unremarkable at the same time, which is really what made me scratch my head. And I remember when Cheyenne and I were thinking of an outro, right? And we were trying to define his legacy. We were like, okay, batting at 3, batting versus India, batting at home, World Cup knockouts. That's probably it. So we were also discussing this with Varun, and we were like, he's definitely not an all-time great. And Varun's like, he's an all-time good. and we love that because that's probably what he is. That's his legacy.
Yeah, I think I did like that line. That was a good one. I remember seeing that one. Well, I think the way I thought about it was, and this is getting really technical, but he's obviously like a plus player, right? Like, yes. As in, there aren't many teams in the world that would not pick a player with his numbers. Like, if you look at someone like Shai Hope, I know Shai Hope's changed of recent times, but you're picking Steve Smith over Shai Hope, right? Like, you just are. And Shai Hope's had a really fantastic ODI career. So he's not a negative player at all. But because he didn't, do you remember, did we do a big, when Mitali Raj retired, did we do a footmarks on her? Were you with us then? I can't remember if you were.
I mean, I was with you when you started footmarks, but I don't think we did one on Mitali Raj. We did one on Meg Lanning.
So my whole thing with Mitali was there were all these young Indians just going, she's a dinosaur, blah, blah, blah. And it's just like, whoa. You have to know that at one stage she was dynamic. Right. And she had some of, incredible power and everything else. Smith's not quite like that because when you go back to even his peak years, he's fine. But he was never like the upper echelon type of player. But what? He learned to play one-day cricket between, let's say, 2005 and 2015. Right. Like, as he's coming through.
Yeah.
The way he played ODI cricket was pitch perfect for that period. The problem is in 2015, England tear it up and everyone else has to catch up. And Steve Smith, outside of one glorious year, never did that. So he's a above average player without any doubt, consistently all the way through, even with the crap about his overseas record, which is not great. But even with that, he's still an above average player.
Yeah.
But he's a player who could have touched greatness, who was an all-time good player, right? Like, it's not quite the same, is it?
It's not the same at all. And you know, when we think of the Fab Four, of course, you know, our mind goes to Test cricket instantly because that's where they truly compete against each other. But if you think of ODI cricket, like Virat Kohli is in a league of his own, and then you've got three blokes when you don't really know where to rank them, right?
I was thinking about Root today when I was writing the piece, because
I would go Joe Root number 2, actually.
Well, I was wondering, like, now we've done this piece, I was like, can we scrap this piece, guys? Can we do Root versus Smith? Because I was a bit shocked. But when you think of Root, I don't think you think automatically of him on his own. Or I certainly don't. Right? And I might think about this differently. But I think about Root as Root Morgan Stokes.
Yeah.
Right? This incredible engine. Whereas if you think about the great Australian teams that he played in, that Smith played in, Warner always outshone him. Maxwell always outshone him. Yep. You've then got Finch for a while, you know, took a lot of the limelight. Not to mention, then you get down to, you know, Stark and, you know, and I suppose late career Hazelwood in one-day cricket as well. Zampa, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of fantastic players, and he's not really... I would never have said that Australia's strength was Steve Smith or Steve Smith's role.
He's
right?
never been the integral cog within Australia's ODI unit, apart from maybe the 2015 ODI World Cup. Yeah.
But you look at Root, and he was, right?
Yes.
That period when they needed Root to be Root, he was absolutely outstanding. And Root changed the game. His overall numbers don't reflect it, but we know that in the middle overs, he was doing things that Smith just wasn't doing, right?
Yeah.
So
and Kane Williamson was required to be the backbone of New Zealand. So he was also doing that, playing to his role.
And that's the other thing with Williamson is, I think Williamson is the ultimate pitch reader, right? Like that's his main skill, let's be honest, of going, 235 par. And everyone else going, you what now? And he'd go, no, 235. And they score 235, the other team scores 234, right? We know that Williamson had his limitations as well.
Yes.
But also, let's be fair, Taylor had some good career. Guptill had some good career. He's played a lot with guys. He hasn't played with Warner, right? He hasn't played with Maxwell. He hasn't had that level of team around him. Bowling attack was good, but as good as Bolt was, Stark was probably at the same level, and Stark had, you know, Hazelwood and Zampa and Cummins and whoever else, you know, even Faulkner back in the day, right? So he had a better bowling attack around him, Smith, and everything else. So I kind of understand Williamson a little bit more. I mean, everyone will know I'm frustrated with both of them just because I know how good they are and I know what they can do, and they didn't do it. But I'm not sure. I'd have to go through Williamson's record with that fine-tooth comb like we have here. Yeah. But I'm not sure that I wouldn't have... I'm not sure that I wouldn't have him slightly higher, Williamson, than Smith, even all things considered.
I'm confused about those two, right? I do have Root at 2. For me, he's after Kohli in ODIs. But yeah, it's tough to kind of pick one between Smith and Williamson, because Williamson's strike rate is even lower. It's low 80s, right, in his career. But then again, we will have to kind of go through all the different things when he retires, and then we can come to a conclusion. Anyway,
maybe when they all retire from ODI cricket, we know it's Virat on number 1, but it would be interesting to go through and really, you know, take a look at it. It's probably Root 2, but Smith and Williamson, I'm not sure there's an awful lot between those two.
Yeah, I mean, we'll have to wait and see for that one. Ideas for the future. But anyway, just to kind of wrap this up, okay, we've discussed Steve Smith's legacy, what he was good at, what he was weirdly bad at, and how both of us think that maybe he just didn't take ODI cricket seriously enough. But when it comes to timing his retirement, right, he might have really aced that bit because he's 35 plus. The next ODI World Cup is, in late 2027, and he'll be 38 by then. And if you look at his test numbers recently, he scored 4 tons in his last 5 games. So he's peaking once again, potentially in test cricket. He's done all right over here, right?
Yeah, I think it's interesting he went to this Champions Trophy because it's not a tournament that Australia takes particularly seriously as a cricket culture. I think we're all aware of that by this point. And as you said, I wonder if he thought, I'll go there. If I'm still making runs, if I'm still feeling good, I'll go to the next World Cup. And he's just got out of it and just been like, we haven't won this. And I'm not going to play that many one-day games and everything else. But yeah, from an Australian point of view, it's weird because he kind of lost his number 3 spot to Marnus already.
Yep.
Right? He's back at number 4.
Also, he's nearing retirement and he probably wants to make a little bit more money via T20s. I feel that has to be a motivator.
It could be. It definitely could be. I probably feel that was the case more if he was definitely playing T20 cricket in major leagues at the moment. Oh no, he did play literally Major League Cricket on Big Bash, so he has played a little bit of it.
Yeah.
I know he's obsessed by America, so I would not be surprised at all if he played a lot more Major League Cricket in America going forward. But yeah, they might have to replace both their number 3 and their number 4 because I'm not sure long term that Marnus always felt like a bit of a stopgap for me in 2023 and hasn't quite worked the way that they wanted it to. So it'd be interesting to see how that goes. They've got Inglis now, who is finally maturing into the player that they want. He can come up to number 4, I would assume.
And Alex Carey could also give them a couple of years at 5, maybe. He's been good.
Yeah. I don't know if they want him that high. I think they might want him lower, but you're right. They can make some and don't forget, they've got someone like Cameron Green who's never really done much in the format. They could use Aaron Hardy up the order. If Aaron Hardy's going to play, I don't really see the point in batting at number 7 for me. If he's going to play, he has to be at least at a number 5 as well. So they've got some options there. But yeah, no, you're right. It's probably a good time for him to leave. But for me, maybe more surprising that he didn't go at the end of the world. When players retire now, it feels... It's so random because you've got 4 things to retire from now if you're an all-format player, right?
Yeah.
All right. You've got all 3 formats of international cricket, and then you've got domestic T20 cricket. I mean, I said this in like 2009 or something that players are retiring in stages, and it's like we're adding extra stages. So it's a fascinating one when players decide to go and what they decide to go from.
You forgot one, by the way. There's also retirement just from the IPL where you get to play other T20 leagues. The Dinesh Karthik retirement.
Is that only Indian players though?
That is only Indian players, but it is a subcategory of retirement.
Oh my God, we're going to have to do a whole video on retirement now.
Anyway, that's it for this episode of the Footmarks podcast. And farewell, Steve Smith from the ODI format. May you light up our screens in Test cricket for years to come. And enjoy your time away from 50 over cricket. Also, to all of you people watching this, do let us know how you feel about Steve Smith's retirement, the timing of his retirement, his ODI career overall, and what his legacy is in the comments section below. And I learned a fair few things when I was doing the research for this. I'm sure that you have as well. Just a quick reminder, you can go to goodareas.co and bookmark that webpage, and that can prove to be your one-stop shop for all the work that we do as part of this team, whether it be written content, videos, or podcasts. We'll see you soon enough on another one of our shows, but that's all for today, folks. Have a good one, and goodbye.
It took God and the demon to build international cricket, but don't tell Johnny Best. 1882, Australia had played 1 test in England against the god W.G. Grace, and they sucked. So they were playing him again, and it was a tough wicket. But England was in front, so Australia was desperate for a 3rd innings lead. At number 8 was young all-rounder Sammy Jones. After a routine single, he walks down to do some gardening on the pitch. Grace whips off the bails and appeals. The ball wasn't dead, Jones was run out. The Australians were furious. In fact, some of the English players were also furious. But what Grace said went, and the umpires had already given it. Next in was Fred Spofford. He was known as the demon fast bowler. He was furious, and he let England know exactly what was coming next, which was maiden. There's 12 maidens. I can't count them all. England only needed 85 to win. W.G. Grace made 32. England only 77. That was the test where the Ashes began. Buy my book, Overthrowing Cricket's Empire, on Amazon today.